I realize there's still pizza to be grabbed, soda to be poured, seats to be found, if you can weather the storm here. This is an exciting crowd, as my good friend Rob Prince was just saying when I came in and we sort of feasted our eyes on this crowd. Rob was saying that this is a healthy sign and it's a vital sign for the Korbel School of International Studies and for our Center for Middle East Studies, and I think for the University of Denver. My name is Danny Postel. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at DU's Joseph Korbel School of International Studies, and I'm pleased to be introducing this very important subject today, and I think an impressive ensemble of voices on one of the most critical issues of our time, the crisis in Syria. The format is very straightforward. I am going to introduce the four speakers, the four panelists. They will each speak for 5 minutes. We were supposed to have been joined by a fifth panelist, Professor Heather Roth Perkins here at the Korbel School. She, however, is stuck in Boulder. Many of you are familiar with the crisis. My son is actually, my fifth grade son is also stuck in the mountains on this school field trip. So a lot of us have been affected by these floods, the muddied and damaged roads. And so Heather could not be here, but I want to just put in a word for Heather. Heather has just published a book on the responsibility to protect and debates about humanitarian intervention. And there's a chapter on Syria, how these questions relate to the case of Syria. So I encourage you all to look up Heather's book that has just been published by Routledge. And Heather has a lot to say on these questions. She's also written 2 or 3 recent op-ed pieces for the Huffington Post on Syria. So although she's not here today, and I will post those pieces to the Facebook event page for today's event. Our first speaker today will be Andrea Stanton. Andrea is an assistant professor in DU's Department of Religious Studies, focusing on 20th and 21st century Islam in the Middle East and beyond. She is also, we are very proud to say, an affiliate faculty member of our Center for Middle East Studies. And she's the editor, quite relevantly, of the Bulletin of the Syrian Studies Association. Her first book, titled This is Jerusalem Calling, State Radio in Mandate Palestine, has just been published this month by the University of Texas Press. And we are very proud to say that on Wednesday, September 25th at noon in the Humanities Institute room, which is Sturm Hall, room 286, the Center for Middle East Studies will be hosting a book launch event for that book. More details available about that later. If you're interested, we'll also have a Facebook event page for it, and you'll see posters up all over campus. But we're very excited for Andrea for the publication of this important book. Andrea also serves as the Religious Studies Department's undergraduate advisor and on the advisory committee for the Intercultural Global Studies minor. Among the courses she teaches are contemporary Islam, Muslim modernities, the social history of the modern Middle East, Islamic fundamentalisms, plural, and cities in the modern Middle East. We look forward to hearing Andrea's perspective. After Andrea, we will hear from Chen Reis, who is Clinical Associate Professor and Director of the Humanitarian Assistance Program here at DU's Joseph Korbel School of International Studies. Before joining Korbel in 2011, Chen was a technical officer for the World Health Organization in Geneva from 2004 to 2011. And before that, a senior research associate at Physicians for Human Rights, USA, in Boston between 2001 and 2004. She's written on a wide variety of humanitarian issues, from war-related sexual violence and other human rights abuses in Sierra Leone and Iraq to maternal mortality in Afghanistan. She teaches courses on health and humanitarian aid, information management in humanitarian crises, and humanitarian systems and policies. Rob Prince is a lecturer here at DU's Korbel School. He's the publisher of the Colorado Progressive Jewish News and a member of Jewish Voice for Peace. He's a longtime commentator for publications such as Foreign Policy in Focus, which is a project of the Institute for Policy Studies, where I was an intern in 1989. Open Democracy magazine, where I was a senior editor back about 10 years ago, and the award-winning Tunisian website Nahwat. Before coming to DU, Rob taught at the Red Rocks Community College in Golden for 15 years and at Metro State for 12 years before that. Here at DU, he contributed to building the undergraduate program in international studies. And we are very pleased to say Rob is also an affiliate faculty member of our Center for Middle East Studies. We look forward to hearing his thoughts today. And finally, our fourth speaker will be Professor Nader Hashemi, who is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at the Korbel School, and also a professor of Middle East and Islamic politics. He is the author of the book Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy, Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies. He's also the co-editor of The People Reloaded, The Green Movement, and the Struggle for Iran's Future. He's also the co-editor of The Syria Dilemma, published, if not timely, published today by MIT Press. So, we're sorry that these books are not yet available, although the publication of the book coincides with this event today. There are not actual books available, except for this one copy. This is the only copy of the book I've ever seen, because Nader was at an event in Washington 2 days ago and brought it back with him. The book will soon be available at our campus bookstore and on Amazon.com and at fine bookstores near you. Without further ado, I would like to hand things over to Professor Andrea Stanton.
So I've been asked to talk about the history. I spent about 5 years spending 3 months or so in living in Damascus, so it's a place that's pretty near and dear to me. But I want to just kind of pull out a few points from the timeline of Bashar al-Assad's Syria, so starting in 2000. So if, for example, you heard Senator Rand Paul talking about Assad having protected the Christians for decades, that's, oh, and there was light. Okay. So if you heard him talk about protecting the Christians for decades, oh, and there was no light. Okay, well, such is the way of teaching sometimes. Sometimes you illuminate and sometimes you obscure, and sometimes you manage to do both. In any case, it's like saying that Senator Rand Paul has been a senator since the 50s. It's entirely inaccurate. You can't, and while I'm happy to talk about Hafez al-Assad's Syria, I think it's more useful for us to focus on the more recent past. So we start in 2000 when Hafez al-Assad dies and Bashar becomes president, right? And this is what I was told at the French Institute in Damascus was called a jemnika. In other words, an inherited presidency, or a combination of a monarchic state and republican state. And there was great hope, right? This is the era of the Damascus Spring, which lasts, oh, I've lost our map. So I put up a map also, not to belittle another political figure, but just to remind us all that Syria is not Iran's access to the sea. I thought we might just have a look at a map just as kind of background information if anyone wants to refer to it also. At any rate, the Damascus Spring, 2000 to 2001, I think it's hard to separate the external interest in the Damascus Spring from the internal. There certainly were things that sound very kind of retro to us, like intellectual salons. There was an opening up of the publication market, limited. But the idea was that Bashar al-Assad was going to be a new style leader. There was also great concern, at least among the chattering classes and the pundit classes, in terms of whether he could really hack it. And I think we need to keep that in mind. I don't want to overly psychologize, but again, this is the one who was not intended to be the heir his older brother Basil was. We used to refer to him of course, affectionately as the Shaheed of speed because he died in a self-induced car accident on the way to the airport road. But at any rate, so Bashar al-Assad was not intended to be president, and so there were all these questions. Oh, you know, he never really was in the military. Oh, he never really was groomed until very late in the day for governance. Will he be able to hack it? Oh, and he's this reformer in the Damascus Spring. So that ends really by late 2001, when there's a new series of arrests and the salons are shut down, and like Ali Farzat's publication is also shut down. And so in 2002, which was the first summer again that I spent in Damascus, I very quickly learned the phrase mihwar al-shar, because that's the phrase axis of evil in Arabic. And Syrians were profoundly offended that they were considered part of the axis of evil. If you actually listen to what President Bush said at the time, they weren't even the main axis of evil. They were like the backup wheel on the axis of evil, so they were like the second tier, but Syrians didn't feel that way. They felt that they were lumped in with these states like North Korea, these pariah states. And when I was at Columbia that year, the outgoing ambassador came and gave a little brown bag, and one of the things he said essentially was that in his perspective, Syria and the United States should be the best of friends. And it was just kind of a global tragedy that they weren't. You may or may not agree with that. Certainly Washington political figures did not agree with that. But the idea that Syria was designated as the axis, part of the axis of evil, was really both kind of offensive to a lot of Syrians, and I think also marked this really downside in relations. 2003, of course, we see the start of a real intense US pushback on Syria for not protecting the border or not closing the border between Syria and Iraq, and saying there are all these foreign fighters going back and forth, to which, of course, Bashar al-Assad, as those of you who are longtime Syria followers will know, said, yes, it's just like you with Mexico. We can't police all of our border, just like you can't police all of your border. I will say that, yes, when I was in Damascus, you know, the road by the Sham Palace, yes, I used to see guys who were dressed in what I would call Afghani costume, who were certainly not Syrian, but they weren't there, you know, back in 2004 when I came back. 2004, we saw warming relations, particularly with Turkey. Huge uptick in Turkish tourism, economic relations with Turkey, also warming relations with Jordan as part of this process of economic liberalization. So that's a second strand to keep in mind, that Bashar al-Assad's also opening up the economy. That also means, and I'm sure many of you know this, he's opening up the technology as well, right? So internet was illegal under Hafez al-Assad. Mobile phones were not present under Hafez al-Assad. My first summer there in 2002, no one had home internet. It was still illegal, but you could go to an internet cafe, and I had a friend who had access to cell phones, and so I got to use his cell phone. And when I pulled out my cell phone on the streets of Damascus, people stopped and turned and looked at me, because no one had a cell phone. But in any case, so that's part of it. It's kind of the economic liberalization, technological liberalization. 2005, major assassination in Lebanon of Rafi al-Hariri in February 2005 becomes a massive, massive challenge for Syria politically, leading to the pullout, leading to several sets of sanctions, but also leading to the Syrian army pulling out of Lebanon in April, missed by, I think, very few, no matter the rhetoric. It's also a really interesting time in terms of Syrian domestic politics. This is when, if I said earlier that Bashar al-Assad, the questions were, will he be able to hack it? That now the question, that what we saw in 2005 was a really intense consolidation of power. All of the guys who kind of helped his father rule either retired, like Mustafa Tlas, who used to hang out at the Sheraton pool and run his publishing company, or they fled the country, like Abdul Halim Khadam, or they were suicided, like Ghazi Kanan. So in other words, there was a real consolidation of power into a much stronger one-man rule. 2006, we saw the Lebanon War. Syria played a strong role in taking in Lebanese refugees, but also I think there's a really crucial moment in which Bashar al-Assad makes the statement about calling the other leaders of the Arab world half men. This is a part of the world in which if you criticize the leader of another country or your own country, that's a punishable offense, right? So those of you who remember President Bush being attacked with a shoe at a press conference in Iraq several years ago, he was, the guy was put in prison not because it was Bush, but because it's offending the dignity of another ruler. So for Bashar al-Assad to say this, keep that in mind, because when it comes to looking for a place for a home in exile, there are a lot of people, Saudi Arabians and others, who may remember that and may not want him there. 2007, 2009, on the one hand, we see this much more aggressive foreign policy from Syria. On the other hand, we saw a tremendous amount of efforts by the EU and also by congressional representatives and senators, particularly Democrats, to reach out and engage Assad. It didn't really work. 2010 is kind of a dead year. And then 2011, we start seeing protests. They're officially Silmiya protests in March, and no one really pays any attention to them, right? All of the effective commentary is, oh, this can't possibly be happening in Syria. No one will be able to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. He's still a reformer. By June is when there's a real shift. There's a shift in two ways. Number one, there's a move towards armed resistance, and number two, there's a major uptick in regional news coverage. This is when Jazeera, for example, starts creating promos to kind of talk about the Syrian revolution in a way that they haven't really covered at all before. They still don't cover Bahrain, so they're still selective, but they really start pumping up their coverage of Syria, and that's what's continued since then. October 2011, the Syrian National Council is formed. March 2012, in other words, a year later, is the first time we see the UN get involved with a peace plan with observers. Obviously, as you know, that doesn't work. December 2012, the US, the UK, France, and the GCC represent this, or recognize the Syrian National Council as legitimate representatives. And then we go on through 2013. I just want to pull out a couple key timeline points. Again, Assad starts weak, consolidates power, now has been there for a long time. This is not a guy who is a weak novice ruler anymore. Took a much harder line and much more assertive foreign policy within 4 years of becoming president than his father did. His father was pretty canny. He's, I guess, canny if he's surviving, but he's been much more assertive. And then also, finally, this question of economic liberalization and technological modernization also meant a huge, huge increase in the economic inequality in Syria, particularly in urban areas, but also in the perception of economic inequality and justice and injustice. So let me leave it at that. Happy to come back. I've got demographic statistics also. I'm happy to talk about those later on.
Thank you, Andrea. Chen Reis.
Okay, I'm going to sit down. Is it working? Yeah, okay, awesome. So what I'm going to talk about is the humanitarian impact and describe a little bit of what's been happening over these years of the conflict. And then talk a little bit about the implications for what happens when there's a resolution of one sort or another, whenever that will be. And when we think of the human impact, we usually think of the conflict itself, and we think about the refugees that are in some of the larger camps, for example, in Jordan. But the reality is that the impacts are also internal in the country. We have currently, depending on whose estimate you look at, about probably 5 million people internally displaced. They haven't crossed the border. They don't have the protections and the access to the resources, and the humanitarian community doesn't have access to them in the way that they do to refugees that have crossed the border. And there's, we've passed the 2 million mark for official refugees at this point, and the number is likely to grow since people are coming across the different borders. Those figures include a little over 230,000 people who were refugees in Syria. So many of those people will not be able to go back home. There were refugees for a reason. That includes people who are Palestinians, it includes Somalis, it includes Sudanese and others. And that's also very important. So these people have essentially, been displaced from their homes by conflict and by violence more than once. And that's quite a typical pattern, and it's a very complex one for helping people rebuild their lives. The other thing I'd like us to think about is the impacts not just of the conflict, but also the impacts of the processes that take place in New York and DC and the Intercontinental Hotel in Geneva. Those processes where people are sitting down and having nice talks over nice food and nice coffee, those have just as much impact on the lives of people and on the situation as the actual fighting does. It doesn't make for as good TV or as good advocacy, but it's really important to consider that has a very important human impact. So some of the impacts that I want to talk about, there's obviously the immediate ones. People don't currently have good access to sanitation, to nutrition, electricity's down, healthcare access is diminished. We're starting to get anecdotal reports in some areas under siege of children dying from malnutrition, and that's a pretty horrible thing, and it really means that the situation's quite dire when you start having people dying because there's no food. And it means that for those people that die because there's no food, there's a lot of them that are very, very much weakened by malnutrition. They haven't died yet, but but the longer we wait, the worse their situation will become. There's very limited humanitarian access to a lot of areas. It's very difficult to negotiate, and that's with all parties to the conflict. It's not just one side or another or one of the sides. There's increasing reports of violence that's very much targeted towards civilians. It's that kind of lower level violence that maybe doesn't make the same kind of headlines that the use of chemical weapons does, but it has just as important implications for people's well-being, physical, psychological, emotional well-being. And then there's also violence against aid workers. I think the latest figures are that 22 workers for the Syrian Arab Red Crescent Society have been killed. They tend to be very clearly marked in their dress, in the vehicles that they use, wearing the Red Crescent symbol. And we don't really hear about that in the news. And that's also important to think about. There are also longer term impacts, and these are the ones that are really gonna matter once the solution is reached, whenever it's reached, and no one thinks that's gonna happen anytime soon. No one that I know, at least. There's been a huge impact on the economy. The currency has been devalued. There's been a lot of disruption to normal aspects of the economy. For example, agricultural sector has been greatly diminished. I think a planting season is coming up, and that's probably not going to happen in the way that it should, which means longer term reliance on external assistance. There's food insecurity. There's increased prices in the markets, longer lines, which also increases people's stress and insecurity more generally. You've got destruction of infrastructure, the power grid, the communications, water and sanitation infrastructure, health systems. Not only are some health facilities actually destroyed or targeted, but you also have disruption of the supply chain. You have, reduced production of pharmaceuticals and materials, so there's increased reliance on the outside. And a lot of health staff have left because they've been able to get out. They've had the types of social networks and resources that are needed to be able to get out of this situation. The education sector is a really important one. Some schools have been, again, attacked and destroyed. Teachers have had to flee along with students. A lot of children, it went from being a situation of almost universal coverage for education for elementary school children, which is almost unheard of. And now there are estimates that as many as 40 or 50% of kids are not going to school regularly. That means that's a delay in their development. It's a reduced opportunity to provide them the assistance that they need. And the reason they're not in school is that they've had to leave their homes, or they're having to support their families because the primary breadwinner is missing or dead or disabled. Or it's simply not safe for them to go to school. And that has serious, again, implications for their development. Some schools are being used as shelters, which is also problematic because it means that you can't actually go to school when the school is being used as a place to live. So the situation right now is winter's coming. It's always harder in winter. It can get pretty difficult in terms of the conditions if the shelters aren't winterized, if the food supplies aren't buffered up appropriately. It's a real problem. The humanitarian appeals are underfunded. A lot of donors are a bit hesitant to get too involved. The global economic crisis has meant that a lot of governments are tightening up their aid programs. And they tend to get very wary of throwing money into situations that are not yet stabilized or resolved. And then the longer it goes on, the more complex the recovery will be. If we're looking at some of the longer term conflicts, Syria started off in a more advanced level in terms of having an educated class, having the infrastructure, having the technology. But the longer this goes on and the more destruction we see to all of that, the more complex it will be to recover. And the international community has a very short attention span or interest span in supporting recovery. And so this is going to already have very long-term implications for the stability of the society in Syria, but obviously also in neighboring countries. Lebanon's on the brink, if it's not already over the brink. Turkey, Egypt, and all these other countries that have received refugees and that are involved in some way will be seeing the implications of this for a very long time.
Thank you very much, Chen. Next, we will hear from Rob Prince.
Thank you, Danny. Let me start by saying how moved I am that we're all here. I'm convinced when we're dealing with situations like the crisis in Syria, number one, that it's important to hear many voices, and that it's really going to be together, both here and beyond, that we're going to be able to come to some understanding of how to deal with this crisis. So I really thank the Center for organizing this. I'm looking at it from a little bit different perspective than the last two speakers. My sense is that a couple of days ago, we just stepped back from the brink. A foot or two, but still, and hopefully that we can go further. My concern is certainly about what's going on in Syria, but the more I looked at the events of the last month, I had a feeling that I was in July of 1914, that it wasn't just the United States and Syria that were involved, but Iran and the Russians and Israel and Jordan. And if you followed the news of this last month, everybody was threatening everybody. And so we reached a point where, as with the beginning of World War I, my fear was a minor incident could have triggered a regional war that who knows where it would have gone. So to see that at least there's a halt on that for the moment, I'm really glad, and hopefully we can deepen that. My starting point is my ending point. There's no military solution to this conflict, and that it's got to be solved diplomatically one way or another. In preparing for my 5 minutes, that's a form of torture to ask someone to speak for 5 minutes, but still, I'm going to try and respect it, believe it or not. I couldn't help but thinking back on a number of events here on campus that I participated in, and I want to share them because I think they shed some light. I kept thinking about an event that happened in February 2003. I was here then, and there was a meeting of security specialists. It was a 2 or 3 day conference, and these were people with quite extensive knowledge in weapons of mass destruction and nuclear policy. I attended one day of the meeting, and what I remember of that meeting is that every single one of these experts, there were 8 or 10 of them, argued that Saddam Hussein not only had weapons of mass destruction, but probably was in the process of developing a nuclear weapons program, although that program had been completely dismantled. Every single one of them supported, as necessary, U.S. military intervention in Iraq at the time. And every single one of them said that the intervention would be easy, or relative, it didn't go that far, but that it wouldn't be that difficult, and that it would be followed by a kind of Marshall Plan to rebuild Iraq. I suggested that maybe there were some geostrategic considerations that were going on in that war, in that possible war, and that at the time, and although it's a little different in Syria, but still, that maybe oil had something to do with it. And I was told that I was way off base. Prince was way off base once again. All right, so I'm thinking about that today, needless to say, when we hear about Assad's use of chemical weapons. And my main concern at this point is, number one, it still hasn't been proven, all right? And that number two, it seems like this last month has been a rush to judgment that reminds me of 2003. Secondly, about 2 years ago, and I think it was an event sponsored by the center, we had another forum on Syria. We had
The center didn't exist then.
so it couldn't have been the center. Well, it was the Middle East Discussion Group. All right, it was good. There were 3 of us, myself, the current dean, Christopher Hill, and I don't remember who the third one was. Do you remember? Joe Silowitz, yes, Joe Silowitz. Now, that's a group that looks at the world from, let us say, diverse points of view. And I thought at that time, wow, this is going to be fun. We're going to go at it from our different points of view. It was, I was disarmed, literally. All right? We all agreed. There was no debate between the 3 of us. Now, what was it that we agreed upon? I wrote it down because I forgot. 1, that Syria would not play out like Libya. A very, very different chemistry was taking place. Secondly, we all agreed that in the Syrian case, there's no good guys. No knights of shining armor in the Syrian conflict. That there were grievances against that the grievances of the opposition against the government were indeed legitimate, at least most of them, but that the opposition itself was a strange coalition of people that was in essence, well, let's leave it like that. Some of that opposition is what I consider legitimate, i.e., the grievances that they're raising about the Syrian government have to be addressed. But some of it, and a good part of it, as is today well known and has come out recently in the last few weeks certainly, that it's dominated by Saudi, Qatari, Turkish, and ultimately, by the way, U.S.-trained back Islamic fundamentalists. So it's a strange combination. And finally, the biggest thing that we agreed upon was that this wasn't going to be solved militarily, that neither side had the advantage, would have the military advantage, and that at the time, which was about 2 years ago, that neither side was ready to negotiate, meaning that the war would continue, and I mean, we didn't predict how awful it was going to be in terms of many of the comments that Chen made, but we had a sense that this could only descend further. Now, I maintain the position that we took 2 years ago here at Korbel remains legitimate, and that whatever we can do to encourage to encourage the negotiating process, which seems to be beginning to take place, that we should do it, and that the other options from where I'm sitting are unacceptable. There are other things that I would get into. I'm rather critical of the American role in this whole thing. I'll just say briefly. It's like a two-track role. On the one hand, the government is, the Obama administration has talked about calling for negotiations for the last several years. That's the official policy. But the other track has been to pretty much support one side and support that side rather significantly, politically, militarily, in other ways. Okay, I'll stop there, though. We can, get into those kind of things in the question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Our final panelist will be Nader Hashemi.
Thank you all for coming. Keenan at the back, can you hear me? Good. Danny mentioned that we just co-edited a book together on Syria. I have an essay in that book. My own views on, I think, what should be done in Syria are there in the book. So I don't want to repeat those views. I just want to throw on the table a set of ideas and reference points that, for me, are central to my own understanding of this conflict. This was advertised as a teach-in, and the differences in the people on the panel, I think, will eventually come out in the Q&A session. But I just want at this moment to throw out a key sort of reference points and a set of facts that have shaped my own understanding about the conflict in Syria and I'll leave the rest to the Q&A session. My point of departure for understanding the conflict in Syria is really within the context of when this conflict began. And it began significantly in the context of the Arab Spring, one of the most important transformative sort of moments in the modern history of the Arab Islamic world, the struggle for democracy, dignity, social justice that began in Tunisia and eventually spread to Syria. It's not a coincidence that this conflict is dated and begins in March of 2011. The Syrian people rose up courageously against all odds, against a brutal dictatorship. And I think one fact that's been sort of lost in the public debate here in the United States over the last 2 weeks is just how brutal that dictatorship is. The nature of that regime, I think, has to be part of the public discussion and has to be a factor in considering how to resolve this particular conflict. If you were to situate Syria on a spectrum of repression among the regional states, it would exist at the extreme end of a spectrum of repression. Arguably, Iraq under Saddam Hussein was worse. It's not an exaggeration to call Syria under the Assads as a neo-fascist state. One family has been in power for 43 years, and they have wreaked havoc and hell upon that country. If you try and oppose that regime, you end up in a very nasty place. No surprise that when the nonviolent uprising began in Syria in March 2011, that the Assad regime responded in the way that it did. I wasn't surprised when I read within the first several months of the uprising, before the first anniversary really, that all of the leading human rights organizations in the world who followed this conflict, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the UN Special Commission of Inquiry all were in agreement. The Assad regime was perpetrating state-sanctioned war crimes and crimes against humanity upon its population. And so no surprise that chemical weapons now have been introduced. Some people want to deny that Assad is responsible, but if you want to deny that Assad is responsible for chemical weapons, how do you explain the 100,000 people that have been killed over the last 2.5 years? The overwhelming majority of those atrocities, according to the human rights groups, attributed to the Assad regime. So we can leave chemical weapons out of this, but we can't ignore the body bags. We can't ignore the 100,000 victims. We can't ignore and should not ignore the nature of this regime. The struggle against the Assad regime, I think, is a noble struggle. It's a moral struggle. It can be defended. The struggle to preserve this regime cannot be morally defended. And those people who try to do so, I think, have a very difficult time trying to justify the unjustifiable. And so that's really my first sort of point of departure. The second point of departure in terms of understanding this conflict is that there's a lot of countries that repress their own populations. When the level of human rights violations reaches the level of crimes against humanity, my position is I have to stop and pause. Wait a second, we need a different response here. We need to stop those atrocities. A third of Syria's population is displaced, 2 million refugees, about 5 million internally displaced. Read the human rights reports that I do. It's really a really grotesque picture. Read the human rights reports even before the uprising began as to what was taking place in the detention centers that littered and were scattered across Syria. Very ugly situation. Those are attributable all to the Assad regime and the way it ruled and the way it perpetrated and perpetuated its political rule over its own society. And so once the level of atrocities reach the level of crimes against humanity, I take a different response. I think the first response from the international community should be to stop those atrocities. The guns have to fall silent. Those aircrafts that are flying in the air and that are committing the atrocities, according to the local coordination committees in Syria. Yesterday, 94 people were killed in Syria, many of them by fighter jets supplied by Russia, targeting rebel strongholds and killing innocent civilians in the process. That has to stop. And that's one of my primary moral concerns in terms of resolving this particular question. And then in terms of what further should be done by the international community, I'm informed by, a basic support and basic defense of the right to self-determination for peoples around the world, including in the Middle East, and including, in this case, the people of Syria. The Syrian people have been denied the right to self-determination, to shape their own destiny, right? We all take for granted. We don't even consider it as sort of being something that we have to sort of struggle for because of the very different political context in which we live in. But in the case of Syria, that's, I think, one of the primary political, questions that inform my own understanding of this topic. And that right to self-determination has been denied the people of Syria in the same way that it's been denied the other people in the Arab world, which is why you had the Arab Spring uprisings. People were tired of living as second-class citizens. They were tired of living a life of indignity. You know, the word dignity in Arabic, or karama, or in Persian, karamat, is really, I think, encapsulates why there was so much anger, frustration, and animosity toward the political status quo across the region. That, you know, we're at the beginning of the 21st century. People are intelligent, they're educated, they look around the world, and they see that, you know, many people around the world have the right to shape their own destiny. They live in democracies, they have the right to organize, mobilize, to try and fight for a better future, but that right has been systematically denied. And it's been denied to them not by the policies of the United States or France or England, but primarily by the ruling elites that have been in control of those countries. Some of them supported by the West, but not in the case of Syria. Syria is a brutal, disgusting, repressive regime. The House of Assad, I think, needs to go. And it needs to go not because I particularly have problems with that regime. It needs to go because my reading of the conflict is that that's what the Syrian people want. And to claim that we really don't know what the Syrian people want is to ignore the fact that we are talking about 43 years of one family rule. Yes, in every dictatorship and authoritarian system, some people like that authoritarian system because they benefit from it politically, materially in some way. But overwhelmingly, I think it's safe to argue that the right to self-determination, the right to live in a democratic society has been systematically denied to the people of Syria. And when they rose up, originally non-violently, but then shifted to a military uprising, they were repressed, and they were repressed quite brutally. And that repression continues today. And that repression will continue even if we solve the question of chemical weapons. That's the underlying root cause of how this conflict began. And until those fundamental aspirations of the Syrian people are addressed, the conflict will continue. And so those are some of the moral reference points that I use in my own interpretation of this conflict. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Nader. I'm going to pose a couple of brief questions, follow-up questions to the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to discussion. So get your questions ready. Andrea, thanks for your historical contextualization of the conflict today. My question for you is Syria going to remain viable as a nation state? Actually existing Syria, if you will. That is to say, in either scenario, if Assad holds on to power, can we still talk about the Syrian nation state such as it is, as we know it, as it has been known since its inception? And also, if the House of Assad were to fall, what kind of nation state would emerge in its wake? Obviously, these are huge questions that you can't answer thoroughly. But if you could just address, I think what a lot of people at the conference that we held here. In fact, you chaired a panel on that exact topic. But what are the possible scenarios for Syria as a nation state in the wake of this conflict?
Do you want to ask us all our questions? Or do you want me to take that?
I just
now?
want you to take that one first.
Okay, well, those are really small questions. So, so the question of can Syria remain viable as a nation state has come up in several contexts. The question of is it more likely that we'll see kind of a rump Syria and then like an Alawi state in one part and a Kurdish state emerging to irritate the Turks on the northeastern part of Syria? It's a bit hard to say. It's a bit hard to say in terms of, in terms of several things. In part, it's related to your second question, which is if the House of Assad were to fall, what would replace it? The House of Assad, this has been one of the kind of hopes from the early U.S. Discussion of the conflict in Syria, that if we could just get rid of Bashar al-Assad, then everything would be fine. If we could just get rid of Bashar al-Assad, then everything would not be fine because of the way in which the bureaucracy of Syria has been so integrated over these past 40 years with Alawi cousins and friends and second cousins and the people they've married and their other neighbors, and some of them are Christian and some of them are still Alawi. So it's not only Alawi, but there are a lot of people who have a major stake in the continuation of the Assad government, not because they love it, but because they fear what would happen to them, reasonably, without, or they don't know what world they would exist in without it. Well, how would they, what if they had to have a real job?
And for context, the Alawis represent approximately what percentage of the Syrian population? 10, 12?
12 is the more common number. This is a part of the world in which census taking is a challenge, mostly for political purposes, but roughly 12%. So they're a big minority. They're not like the Druze. The Druze are like 2%. So it's a meaningful number. You can't kill them all, right? I mean, from practical purposes. So
and also, just to point out, not all Alawis support the House of Assad.
No,
some are actually active with the opposition.
That's true, right. So we don't want to overly categorize people. Oh, you're Christian, you must support the Assads. Oh, you're Sunni, you must be an extremist, etc. But so if they fall, one of the arguments has been, well, where do the Alawi go? Do they stay in a Syria in which they may all, by virtue of sect, by virtue of bloodletting that comes after the fall of Assad himself, that they may be vulnerable? And so, of course, Josh's argument last January was that they'll all flee to Lebanon, which will be a disaster for Lebanon demographically, or they will form this kind of rump state with some access through Latakia to the sea. So it really depends on how the fall of Assad goes. To Rob's question about a political settlement versus a military settlement, then a political settlement might create greater space for the viability of Syria as a nation state. There's a whole argument about the artificiality of national borders that comes at they were drawn up at the end of World War I. I think at some point, yes, we recognize that they were artificial. We also need to recognize that those borders were drawn up in 1920, and that's a long time ago. I presume none of us were alive then. That is enough time. Oh, okay, sorry. Most of us were not alive then. But so that's plenty of time in which generations pass and people get used to the notion of a nation. What we used to say is that Syria talked about the Qawm, and that they talked about being a small part of an Arab nation rather than a real nation state unto themselves. But I think we need to recognize that the physical borders, passports, visa requirements do create realities, and no one else wants those rump parts of Syria either. So.
Chen, there's a lot of talk, and Rob sort of touched on it a bit. There are many reports, including one yesterday, that atrocities have been committed by both sides of the Syrian conflict, the Assad regime as well as the rebel forces. From a humanitarian perspective, can you give us some sense of what percentage of the humanitarian crisis and the atrocities that produced that crisis can be laid at the feet of the regime versus rebel forces?
The simple answer is no. I mean, I think it's very difficult at this stage, given the complexity of access, the confusion around, the sort of what's actually happening and who's who and who's what, and really unpacking all of that, plus the very vested interest that people have who are providing some of that information. And there's some organizations doing amazing work trying to unpack that, but it's very hard to unpack in real time. So Human Rights Watch does great work, but they will themselves admit that there are many unknowns amongst what they can have some clear evidence for. But the reality is that no one's hands are clean. There are atrocities and violations of international law committed by all sides. Not all sides are necessarily bound by that law officially. But the reality is that, whenever you have a conflict, it is very difficult when you have any kind of military intervention or armed force participation to come out without atrocities being committed. And so at this point, it's hard to really attribute, but the reality is that everyone is committing violations. However, I think that a very large number of very significant violations are being committed by the regime. There's a lot of evidence for them using their, sort of military might to commit, sort of mass atrocities. The report about the chemical weapons is due any day now, and it will probably at some point be made public. But I think people who sort of want to pretend that that's not happening, and want to pin all the blame on opposition groups, I think that that's not right either.
Nader, you had a follow-up.
I think in this debate about atrocities and which side is worse, and as we hear in this debate that there's no good guys and they're all basically bad. You listen, for example, to Rand Paul. He says, look, it's a choice between Assad, who's a disgusting dictator, and Al-Qaeda on the other hand. I think those are gross distortions. Read the human rights reports on Syria. They clearly state that the overwhelming majority of the atrocities can be laid at the doorstep of the Assad regime.
Andrea, you had
there's no ambiguity about that. Second of all, in all conflict, when there's a raging war taking place, atrocities are committed. Just to put it in perspective, during World War II, the Allied forces committed a lot of atrocities. Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Does that mean there was moral parity between the Allies and the fascist forces in World War II? In the Rwandan genocide, the Rwandan Patriotic Front that stopped the genocide, they committed a lot of atrocities. Their hands aren't clean, but is there moral parity between those people who perpetrated the genocide and those people who tried to stop it? And I think there's a deliberate attempt, and a very disgusting attempt, to deliberately try and elevate the behavior of the rebel opposition to try and bring it to the same level of the Assad regime. Not because that's factually the truth, because there's an attempt to defend an ideological position, and that is not a contribution to our understanding of this topic. It subtracts from our understanding of this topic. And the debate on this can easily be settled by just reading the groups that have investigated the human rights conditions and look at the reports, and it's pretty clear who's responsible. So I think we have to have clarity on this and not allow, deliberate attempts for ideological reasons to distort our understanding of who's responsible for the majority of atrocities in Syria today.
I think we might
quickly,
also
Andrea, Chen, and Rob.
You're about to lose control of
No,
this,
no,
aren't you?
not at all. We're not anywhere near that point yet.
I think we might also want to distinguish between human rights violations committed against civilians and those who are actively fighting, whether they are Shabiha or whether they are government soldiers or whether they are opposition fighting forces.
Shabiha meaning the militias, pro-Assad militias.
Right, yeah, the informal militias. So I think we do want to distinguish between those who have chosen professionally to take up arms versus those who are full-on civilians.
Which is actually, I'm just going to do a plug for the book. There's a chapter in the Syria Dilemma written by Mary Kaldor of the London School of Economics, who actually drives home this point, where she says a lot of the debate about the Syrian conflict has gotten mired in the question of who are the rebel forces, which side should the international community support. She said, if you really focus on the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, or a humanitarian strategy, as she calls it, to alleviate the violence in Syria. She says we should really just be looking at civilians. Any intervention, whether violent, non-violent, or what have you, should be focused on civilians being killed. She actually calls for I think she calls it a no killing civilians zone, or no killing civilians zones throughout Syria. So just to amplify your point, Chen and then Rob.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, I completely agree with you. I was not trying to make any kind of moral equivalency between the different sides, but what I was trying to point out is that at the same time, we don't want to obscure the fact that we are looking at a very complex, we're not in the era of, white hats and black hats. So some hats are blacker than others. If we want to use that kind of Western analogy, but the reality is that in thinking about what's happening next and in who we're working with, we do need to consider how ready a lot of these groups might be to transition into a peaceful form of governance that is better than and that is more responsive to the population and to the population's needs than the current regime is or has ever been. And I think that in that we really do need to be very open and honest and not do it in a way that is overly kind of one side or the other or feeding into a specific agenda, but just really to try to have more transparency and clarity about what everyone's doing. And that's very difficult to do for a lot of reasons right now. That's what I would say.
Rob?
Couple of points. Nader, in terms of how you were talking about the conflict, I really sit on that side that you're criticizing, all right? Because I see the conflict really differently. So my first point is, you argue that people are looking at this conflict the way I do. We're ideological, all right? But so are you. You're coming from another ideological perspective. And then I just want to remind you of something. Now, look, this is actually a debate between friends, all right? And we are, and with a lot of mutual respect here. But when the event started in Libya, I saw something that was to me personally disturbing. And what it was that the question of humanitarian interventionism was going to be used as a pretext for NATO intervention. And as I recall, I'm not saying that you supported the NATO intervention, but you, okay, all right.
And proudly.
Yes, and I proudly opposed it and still do.
Let's get into it then.
Well, we are. We're getting into it. But we're getting into it. Right. My point is this. If one looks only at the humanitarian element of these things, there's a political aspect to American foreign policy. And I don't think that it's all humanitarian. So what I saw in the Libyan case was using humanitarian intervention as a pretext, if you like. Now, yes, there were problems on the ground. Did we know for sure that we were headed for some kind of mass slaughter in Benghazi? That is really open to question, Nader. That was not at all clear. I see more or less the same thing unfolding now. Is there a horrible crisis going on in Syria that everybody admits to? Whether we have different formulas of who's committing the atrocities, it's granted. Okay, it's true. But what you're doing now, or what I see you doing is talking about the Assad regime. I'm not a fan of the Assad regime. I've been criticizing the Assad regime from the 2-week time that I spent in Syria, 30 years ago, admittedly, when I found it the most repressive regime in the Middle East. So this isn't a question of supporting Assad. But there's some other regimes in the Middle East that are pretty repressive, and I think they're up there with the Syrian regime. And we haven't been hearing much about them. Take, for example, Saudi Arabia, what's going on in Bahrain. So it's not that I disagree with your criticisms of Assad and the regime, but they seem, number one, somewhat selective. Number two, my concern is, and you didn't take it this far in your discussion, but it seems like you were on the edge of this, that given the way you talk about the situation in Syria, that you support military intervention. All right, so that's where I draw the line, period. Okay. That military intervention, regardless of how you look at, and particularly U.S.-led military intervention, U.S. strike, this is a formula for just going in a really bad direction. We have no right to be there, and it's a very destructive policy. So for me, that's the core of the debate. The core of the debate is not whether we're dealing with a good regime or a bad regime. Is military intervention in any way, shape, or form going to be able to deal with this issue? And my answer to that is no. Okay. Period.
Nader, do you want to respond briefly to that? And then we need to open it up to general Q&A.
Right. Yeah, Rob, again, I want to emphasize this is a debate between friends, and I respect your position. But at the end of the day, I disagree with it fundamentally. Right, yeah. And I think the core of the issue is military intervention. And I'm glad you raised the question of Libya, because I'm very proud of the position that I took on Libya, and I still defend it. And I think there's a lot of symmetry here between the situation in Libya, the question of foreign intervention that did take place, and what's happening in Syria today. And at the end of the day, I think it boils down to this for me. It really doesn't matter what Rob Prince thinks, what Nader Hashemi thinks, or what Danny Postel or anyone in this room thinks. For me, I think what fundamentally matters is what do the people of Libya and what do the people of Syria want? What do they want from the international community? What do they want in terms of their own future? In the case of Libya, the overwhelming, I think, preponderance of evidence suggests that the people of Libya wanted NATO to come to their rescue during their time of need when Gaddafi was trying to crush a popular uprising. Go to the streets of Benghazi and Tripoli today, and people on the left don't like this, but again, it doesn't matter what you like or you feel. There are American and French flags, understandably so, waving in the breeze because those are the countries that came to the defense of the people of Libya. When you say that Gaddafi was heading to Benghazi and maybe he was going to massacre them, maybe not, if you think that there's doubt about this, then we are really living in different universes here. The nature of that regime is pretty clear to me. What he would have done to the people of Libya when those tanks were on the border of that town are pretty clear. And the same with respect to the question of Syria. We know what the Assad regime has done in the past, before the uprising began. We know that what they have done now. The human rights reports, I think, are pretty crystal clear. And again, the question of military intervention comes down to what do the people of Syria want? Do they want to live under that tyranny? Do they want military intervention to stop the atrocities? My reading of the conflict is that not every single Syrian, but the vast majority of them want to be rescued from the house of Assad that is perpetrating massacre after massacre and now chemical weapons on a civilian population.
Brief comment from Chen, and then I'm going to go to questions.
I just want to clarify something because I think we're using the term humanitarian in different ways here. When I talk about humanitarian assistance, I'm talking about assistance that is premised on humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, humanity, and independence. And that's very different from humanitarian intervention doctrines that are about picking a side and sending in a military. For the humanitarian sector, the aid groups, the ICRC, the International Rescue Committee, the UN agencies, it's not about any of that. It really is about no matter who is preventing the access, no matter who's in control of a territory, they need to allow that community to come in and provide people with the basic things that no longer exist for them in the way that they did before: healthcare, food, the basics of survival. And I think that that's a very important distinction, and that's what I focus on. And it's when I talk about humanitarian, that's what I'm talking about.
Very important distinction.
Okay.
Thank you for that point
Thank you
of clarification.
for letting me do that.
Absolutely. Andrea, one last comment.
I think, yeah. I think that some of the questions that we might be asking are, this has been a crisis for Syria since 2011. I've been watching videos of people holding dying children and dead children since 2011. So the question I think for us is also, why is it a crisis for the US now? Why is it a crisis for the international community now? And I think that leads us to questions of what are the moral concerns here and what are the political concerns here? And that also takes us back to the question of sovereignty. And what do you as the head of a state have the right to do? And when do moral concerns supersede the rights of sovereignty? And also, when do moral concerns supersede the question of state interest? Our moral interest as Americans and as citizens and as humans may be different from our political interest.
That is indeed a huge set of questions, and let's move now to the Q&A period. Yes, sir.
I have 3 questions.
I'm afraid we only have time for one, so pick your favorite. We only have time for one question. I'm so sorry. Would you mind standing up just so that the audience could hear you a bit better? Thank you.
What do you think the future of regime in Syria, combined with the Iraqi crisis in 2003 on the level of destruction of weapons of mass destruction?
And Rob, would you mind just kind of slightly restating the question for the cameras?
You're asking me to compare the future, or give an idea of what I think the future of Syria will be compared to what happened to Iraq in the Iraqi war. I've thought about that some, and needless to say, it's just speculation, right? We don't know. What I would say without getting into the details is look at Iraq today. It's a much weaker place than it was. it's barely a centralized state. I don't know what the future of Syria is, but my hunch is it's going to be a much weaker centralized state at best. When I look at what I consider from what I've studied, the best scenario is both sides are going to have to make some concessions in negotiations. That's clear to me, and I mean serious concessions. I can't say, the idea that one side is going to be able to impose its will on the other in the Syrian situation. I don't think that's realistic. If negotiations actually take place, needless to say, there's going to be, the other players are going to be very active in it, the United States, the Russians, the Iranians, even the Israelis on some level. So it's hard for me to say. I do think that in the end, I remember a bumper sticker from very long ago, and what it says is if you're not preparing for peace, you're preparing for war. And I still believe that deeply. So I'd like to just, not knowing where peace processes can go and diplomacy can go, and realizing that it's going to be a complicated process, I still think it's much better than continuing on the direction. If we continue on the direction that Syria continues in this direction, again, I doubt there's going to be a winner, either side. And the end result is something close to a collapse of Syria as a nation.
Rob,
so I'd like to see that stop.
Just as a quick follow-up, what do you think of the fact that all of the efforts to date by the United Nations, for example, Kofi Annan, special envoy of the UN and the Arab League to Syria, quits in frustration. All of his efforts over many months came to naught. His successor, Lakhdar Brahimi, almost as frustrated as his predecessor. All of the efforts, the Geneva process, all have come to naught. There is a stalemate.
I agree. But it becomes, Danny, a question of spin because one side will say, well, who is it that sabotaged the negotiations? And the other side will say, it's the other side. I think the point that I made earlier about that 2 years ago, neither side was ready and willing to negotiate, that they still hadn't exhausted their, whatever you want, their tension, their hatred for one another. We're a little bit further along, much more destructive process. I see an important role for the international community through the United Nations. I'd like to see that, that revived. And I think it was very hopeful that the current Secretary of General was very hesitant to, in fact, more than that, he opposed the Security Council being used for military action against Syria at this point. So I see we've moved back from the brink a few steps, and my main concern beyond arguing with Nader is how can we deepen this process? How can we move this process in a way that we get further away from the brink? Any solution in this case is still going to be very, very difficult. The country is, for all practical purposes, nearly destroyed. I understand that.
Maybe we can open these shades here because we're no longer using the screen. Why don't we go ahead and do that? Thank you. Yes.
About the viability of international military force. You read about, number one, a political solution, and number two, in establishing some kind of humanitarian aid corridor, a no-fly zone, things like this, in light of not only 2003 Iraq, but also in light of Bosnia, Kosovo, and the 1990s no-fly zone. And this would be the whole goal.
I have a feeling Nader might have some thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, it's a difficult project to take on because you have a deeply entrenched repressive state that's in power, that's backed by one of the regional powers, Iran, and one of the regional global powers, that are not open to humanitarian corridors or to, and they will resist any attempt to have international sort of humanitarian aid given, particularly to the side that they're trying to crush. The reason why I think it failed in Bosnia and ultimately led to Srebrenica and perpetuation of the genocide there, is because the international community, like today, took a very sort of weak position with respect to intervening to solve the humanitarian crisis. For the first 3 years, the international community viewed the conflict in Bosnia as one of ancient ethnic hatreds. We're not going to address core causes. We're just going to address human suffering. We'll send humanitarian corridors into safe havens such as Srebrenica, but if the Serbs block it, well, then we can't do much about it. So if there was a policy that was backed up by a serious plan to address humanitarian suffering, then theoretically it would work. But having said that, as I tried to address in my initial remarks, the problem of humanitarian suffering is just a Band-Aid solution. What are we going to do, just sort of give food to people so they can live another day to have them die at some point down the road? You need a fundamental resolution to the core political conflict in Syria. And that core political conflict, in my reading, is that you have 43 years of one-family rule, and you have a domestic uprising that was crushed and turned violent and turned to guns because there was no other. So unless you address that fundamental, then the conflict continues. So, Syria is it's much more difficult than Libya, much more difficult than other conflicts. But then again, Bosnia and Kosovo were very complex as well. And those conflicts eventually were solved because there was political will at the international community among the key players to solve that conflict. And until that political will, which can be generated by, I think, popular opposition and mobilization in democratic societies, forcing democratic leaders to take a stand. Until that political will exists, then the conflict is going to, I think, continue to metastasize and get worse and lead to more violence and bloodshed.
As Michael Ignatieff says in this book, The Syria Dilemma, Bosnia is not paradise today, but the killing has stopped. Andrea?
I wanted to say two things. I think one of the things that your question brings up is for me this idea that either a military or a political solution, that if you support one, you can't support the other. If you support the other, you can't support the one. And I think what your question also asks is about the use of a military intervention to bring about a political solution, which I think is something we might want to keep in mind. I would just say logistically, just to add to what Nader said, that on the one hand, you could fairly easily reach a lot of the so-called rebel-controlled or Kurdish-controlled areas, whether for a humanitarian corridor or to protect militarily. The Syrian Air Force is not like the Libyan Air Force. If you've traveled around Syria outside the cities, you realize that vast swaths of the country are forbidden for photography, as they say, because they are all military installations, and there are big airplane hangars kind of throughout, like the way from Damascus to Aleppo, for example. So it's not as simple, and it's not as simple procedurally, but it also means that that establishing, say, a no-fly zone would have far more potential for military casualties, and that's a big political issue as well as a moral issue.
Okay, next question from Tamra Destre.
Yeah, thank you. I want to first thank the panelists for interesting comments and sharing your knowledge with us and sharing your opinions with us. The conversation seems to be moving somewhat in this direction already, but one of the concerns I have is that in the public debate, we seem to be conflating two questions. One is whether or not Assad needs to go, and the other one is how does Assad go? And what you end up happening is an oversimplification where it's either he stays or he goes militarily, when clearly another answer is how does he go in a non-military way? So I would really enjoy hearing from the panelists. I know you're starting to have this conversation. What are our other options that may remove this regime but not create the seeds of future problems?
Very good question. Who would like to address that from the panel?
I'll take a quick stab at it. I mean, if you can provide any evidence where a long-standing dictator has left office, not only himself, but the structure of power that is oppressing that society has left office through non-military means, I'd love to hear the story. I wish there was an option, and that's fundamentally the core of the problem. He's occupying a position in power. He behaves as if him and his family and his regime and his party are there by divine right. And they're not going to leave just because, the people of Syria are asking him to leave or the international community is outraged over what he's doing. So I really wish there was a nonviolent way, but in the history of sort of struggles for democracy and struggles against dictatorship, I can't think, and I haven't studied this, I'm just speaking off the top of my head, of one case that you can point to where a long-standing entrenched dictatorial regime was removed from power through non-military means.
What about Ben Ali and Mubarak?
Okay, Ben Ali and Mubarak. Well, that was tried in Syria. Excellent point. They rose, the people of Syria rose, exactly inspired by the Ben Ali and Mubarak sort of paradigms. But of course, the difference is that you have a regime that's fundamentally much more repressive than the regimes that you mentioned. And so they were crushed brutally. So theoretically, it can happen, and they did try it. But now we're in the second phase of the struggle, where it shifted to a military conflict, primarily because the option of a peaceful revolution was brutally crushed by the Assad regime and one other component, while the rest of the world, including all of us in this room, stood on the sidelines and did nothing. So that's the other component of the story. Had we supported, and one of the reasons why the conflict, I think, turned violent was because the absence of serious moral and political support for the nonviolent uprising in Syria allowed Saudi Arabia and Qatar to step in and to sort of hijack the revolution, provide arms to sort of extremist groups, and they became key players. So there was a time when this thing could have perhaps succeeded nonviolently. But it didn't happen, and unfortunately, there's no going back once things have shifted in that direction.
Does anyone else on the panel want to address that? Rob?
Yes. I'm going to address your question, Tamara. I'm not sure. I don't know that I accept even the assumption there that the goal is just to get rid of Assad. The goal is to have a negotiated settlement between the parties. That one of the results might be that he goes, it's possible. But that's not clear to me. So if that's the way that the negotiations are going to be put forward, that the goal is to regime change in the end by negotiation rather than by military means, I don't think they're going to go anywhere. Again, that's the kind of thing that would have to come out of the negotiations. What's going to be the future of the regime? One other point here. Granted, again, I'm not defending this regime, but your characterization of this regime, Nader, is, I think, inaccurate. This regime has a base. It has a much broader base than Gaddafi's regime had. There's support there. Obviously, the base is not so extensive, but you have the different minority groups. They're with Assad, and the Assad regime has supported them. Some of these minority groups are quite frightened of the idea of a rebel victory. And in fact, the reason that Assad has been able to survive it, I'm convinced, is not only because of the levels of repression, but because there's actually some support there. So basically, what I'm looking at it from a little different point of view. I'm looking at what's the balance of power today in Syria, and how can, given that there's obviously a split between these different factions, but they both have a constituency. So this is, and neither of them can eliminate the other side. All right. Assad has not been able to stop the rebellion, but the rebellion has not been able to overthrow Assad. All right, that's where we're at. What you're suggesting, at least, again, you get to the edge of it, but what you're suggesting is the only way that this thing can be resolved is through military means. I don't know that you've said outright that you support U.S. military intervention, but it sure sounds like you're pretty close to it. And I'm saying that is a dead end. That's only going to make the situation worse. This is not a conflict that can be resolved militarily.
Well, a couple of points. Let me just quickly respond. I never said that the Assad regime has no base of support. All regimes, all authoritarian regimes have a base of support. Yes, granted, I think the Assad regime has, a greater base of support than Gaddafi did. But I'm very wary about those people who claim that authoritarian regimes that have been in power for 43 years sort of have a big base of support. The only way you know how big the base of support is if you have a way of measuring that support. And that's why we have elections. And that's precisely the point of the Syrian uprising. We don't have elections. We don't have accountability, which is why we need to move in that direction. So that's point number one. Second of all, getting back again to the question of military intervention. I'm not ideological on the question of military intervention, particularly U.S. intervention. Broadly speaking, I think sort of U.S. intervention, both political and military, within the Middle East, broadly speaking, has been, to put it bluntly, a disaster. But there are exceptions. I think U.S. intervention in Bosnia and Kosovo helped stop the bloodshed. My criticism of U.S. foreign policy in Bosnia was not that it happened, but it happened 3 years too late. My criticism of sort of U.S. foreign policy in Kosovo was that there was a domestic uprising that was nonviolent in Kosovo for many years, headed by Ibrahim Rugova. We should have supported that. With respect to Libya, I think the intervention by NATO helped topple a dictatorial regime. Now, people will say, well, look at the chaos, look at the destruction, look at how could that be a positive step in the right direction? Look what's happening in Libya today. Absolutely, there is chaos in Libya, but I think Libya is much better off today with the possibility of perhaps moving in a democratic direction, when under Gaddafi there was zero chance of any political reform. And plus, that military intervention was broadly supported by the overwhelming majority of Libyans. Yes, there was a domestic support base there. People in Gaddafi's home village didn't like the intervention. So I'm not ideological on the question of military intervention. I think if there's a right type of military intervention, particularly an intervention can stop mass atrocities, as took place in Bosnia, as took place in Kosovo, as took place when the Vietnamese intervened in Cambodia, as took place when India intervened in East Pakistan, as took place when Tanzania intervened in Uganda. I mean, those are atrocities that I think had to be stopped, and they were stopped not because, people in the United States sort of organized and mobilized and sort of were taking positions to the contrary of intervention. They took place because those interventions, for better or for worse, stopped mass atrocities. I think those societies are, looking back in history, much better off than they were before the intervention took place. So I think we have to, in my view, just to sum up, I think we have to look at each case on its own basis. I don't believe in one size fits all. I think we have to look at each individual case and see whether a particular military intervention will contribute to alleviating human suffering or not. That's my position.
Chen?
Just a quick thing about the negotiations and the whole question of Assad, and my suspicion is that if anything comes out of these negotiations, it will be something about the chemical weapons that will sort of pacify people for a short while. I think, based on everything that I've read and heard from people who are involved, the issue of Assad is a non-negotiable on both sides. The Assad regime and his supporters, including Russia, don't currently want to see him go or have a scenario where he's not in power. And the other side has no scenario where he is in power. And as long as those non-negotiables exist, you can't really have a negotiation and a political settlement. And so I think that's
which is why there hasn't been one until now.
Right, and I think that's a big issue. So where we are right now with these negotiations, I think we need to also just keep our expectations quite low and realistic.
Point well taken. Andrea?
I just wanted to go back into the notion of setting this within the context of the Arab awakening or the Arab Spring. To the question of Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak in Egypt, yes, so they each left, but in each kind of wave of the Arab Spring countries, you see the stakes get higher for the rulers who are still left, right? So Ben Ali leaves Tunisia peacefully, goes to Saudi Arabia. Maybe that's not the place you want to spend the rest of your life, but he's out and he's safe and he's got his money. Mubarak loses his position and stays in Egypt, and he's on trial. Yes, he's now been released with time served, but he goes through the humiliation of a public trial. Then we go to Libya, and so the stakes get much higher. The stakes are that if you are an unpopular dictator and you lose and the situation is militarized, you die and your body is humiliated, right? So with each of those waves, the stakes go higher. And so in that way, I think, again, I would say that getting rid of Assad, it's not really the head of the snake, as they overly used analogy goes these days, but it is for him and for the people who are aligned with him in key positions, the cost of losing is also, as Chen puts it, non-negotiable. And again, I would just go back to the very unsexy but important position of the military, which is that in Tunis and in Egypt, the military ultimately sided with the people. Well, who knows what the Egyptian military and the people are now, but they were,
right,
one hand during the revolution, whereas in Syria, the military has stayed largely on the side of the government.
Excellent point. Let's go to the next question, please. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Harrison Freedom with the International Security Program here. Curious to get the panel's thoughts on the comments made by Secretary Kerry just a few days ago, which have been characterized by many as a gaffe or a misspeak. Given how quickly the Russians and the Assad regime responded with a proposal, given that the words were spoken right on the eve of a U.S. military strike, and given that President Obama met with President Putin just a week earlier at the G20, do you think that it's possible that maybe this isn't a gaffe, that maybe what we're seeing is a well-orchestrated effort among all the parties involved to try and find a resolution to this problem short of the use of force?
Who would like to address that question? Anyone on the
Quickly
panel?
take a stab at it. I don't think any of the sides really want to get involved in Syria, and so it was in many ways a way out for the Obama administration. They didn't want to get involved. They made it all about chemical weapons, and so Russia sort of took advantage of it and really boxed the Obama administration into a corner. Okay, so if the problem in Syria is fundamentally about chemical weapons, as Obama is claiming it is, well then let's remove the chemical weapons, problem solved. So I think Kerry boxed himself into a corner. I think the Obama administration did. And so that's why we're having these negotiations in Geneva. And so, you know, and because there is a convergence, I think, of opinion here among many of the key players, including Assad, that they don't want to see external military intervention in Syria. And Obama doesn't want to go there because public opinion overwhelmingly is against it. As he claimed, I think rightfully he's being honest when he said, I was elected to end wars, not start them. But the fundamental reality is that Syria keeps dragging Obama back, despite his attempt to run in the other direction. The human suffering, the collective suffering of the Syrian people, now involving chemical weapons, and now, you know, involving U.S. vital geostrategic interests, forces him to respond to the question. But he's not responding, I think, to the question, to the problem in the way that I think it should be responded to, dealing with core problems, fundamental principles that speak to the nature of the conflict in Syria.
You also have a convergence of public opinion, not only so between Western allies. So you have the British Parliament, which voted no on Prime Minister Cameron's proposal to support a strike, which he decided to heed. The only major Western country supporting Obama's position is France, and it turns out that public opinion in France is actually strongly against a strike. So there's a convergence of public opinion in several states. Yes. Rob?
I have no idea whether it's orchestrated or not. You know, it's a very good question. It certainly looks curious at the least. What is it that we know? We certainly, at the very least, what the Obama administration was engaging in brinkmanship, and it seemed as if we were on the edge of some kind of major cruise missile strike. Then I think that the vote in the British Parliament was a real blow, a very powerful blow to this plan. And then there's something else, and Danny alluded to it, but I want to go into it. Public opinion in the United States. 2 weeks ago, it was, 53% against intervention. A week ago, it was up to beyond 60. Today, it's close to 70% against intervention. And of course, what's interesting is where the thrust of the opposition is coming from. It's not coming from our little peace movement. It's coming from the right. You know,
Rand Paul.
Ron Paul, Rush Limbaugh. But they say politics makes strange bedfellows. But this is, I think that this is what Obama had to consider, that all of a sudden an ally that's been with the United States and intervening quite frequently, its population was against. And then the turn of the American population. And if you listen to the number of times that Obama lately has come before the media to try to explain his case. And what has been his message essentially? This is not Iraq. What is it that the American people think? This is Iraq. Okay? So I don't know how much that entered into it, but it really what Putin did was to give Obama an out. Now, of course, this is very temporary. From where I'm sitting, how can we deepen this process so that it's not just about the use of chemical weapons, but it's moving in a more serious political resolution to this problem?
Thank you, Arthur.
I'm I'm just trying to think ahead as to what's going to happen. Once chemical weapons are off the table, which I think is likely to occur because both sides have found this to be both a distraction and an annoyance, what is really going to happen? And here I would love to chat with you further. Will not be peace, but continuation of a proxy war by conventional means, which means that the model you want to look at is Afghanistan and the Russians, and secretly the United States duped it out for many years, and then ultimately morphed into the Taliban. This is the risk, but it seems to me that removing chemical weapons is not going to lead anywhere to anything that looks like a negotiated peace, but a continuing war and a lot more bloodshed as both sides fight for their positions, particularly the United States, Russia, and Iran, in the Middle East, until these countries, which au contraire, in terms of permanence, will collapse, because the general trend since 1914 that you opened your comments with will continue, and states are falling apart in many, many ways. My God, Syria, if Eastern Colorado can try to succeed, why not have this thing? Right. Syria. And this is part of a long historical trend line which has been going on ever since that July, August of 1914. And it seems to me that it's much more likely that countries like Syria and Iraq will disappear. And some regions, probably Turkestan and curiously Israel, will benefit from this, because the states that they face as larger countries will not be smaller countries. But it seems to me that even getting rid of chemical weapons is no cause for celebration. Quite the contrary. I wish it was like what you say, but I don't think so. I think the Afghan model that I referred to is far more likely, and that the violence is going to go on for a very long time.
I was already going to nod towards you, Andrea, because this question obviously points to exactly what you were talking about, which is the institution of the nation-state of Syria and its creation in the ashes of World War I.
Okay, so I think it's very tempting for everyone to look back for historical models, but all analogies break down. So I'm not quite so focused on historical models as I am just kind of the picture of what's happening. But if we were to look at one, I'm in some ways, I think you're right that chemical weapons is not addressing the question of chemical weapons. It's in a way, it's not designed to stop the war, right? I mean, you hear that quite explicitly from people in our administration. We certainly understand it coming from the Russians. It's designed to set the parameters on the methods of killing, not on the fact of killing. Those are two very, very different points. And I think that's why you've seen so much upset from the various Syrian American groups active in the U.S. that, we've been sold out. Here it is. He goes back to killing in other forms. You can still use mass atrocities.
Right.
And
the vast majority of deaths in the Syrian civil war have been committed without chemical weapons.
Right, yeah. It's perfectly possible to kill people in large numbers without using chemical weapons. But I think your question of, is this a proxy war, your suggestion that this will become a proxy war, I see this coming up over and over. Oh, is it a proxy war will it be a proxy war between Russia and the United States? Is it a proxy between the United States and Iran? I think,
Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Right, yeah, the Saudis and the Qataris, who we know have been, at it in terms of major regional player for some time. I would actually look next door to Lebanon and say that Lebanon had a longstanding civil war that had plenty of external involvement, including from the United States, and yet was not a proxy war. It was a real hard fought out internal conflict. So I'm a little concerned about overstating the case of it being a proxy war. And again, I think that it still brings us back to the questions of what as humans do we feel is our responsibility here, and what as Americans do we feel is our responsibility or our best interest here.
Let's go to unless somebody else had a response to that, let's take one or two final questions. If I see any hands up. Yes.
Sure, and speculating, I know, but what might be the implications of a U.S. strike in Syria from the international community? What might be the reactions there? I know Iran is the threats.
Yeah, I think Rob actually touched on some of this in his initial remarks, harking back to World War I. Rob, do you want to elaborate on that at all?
We don't know. There's one line of thinking that I've seen in the media that if the United States strikes Syria, I'm sorry. They do kind of get mixed up here, don't a little bit. But if they strike Syria, somehow that Syria will, kind of just absorb the blow, not respond at all. And if you think about it, that's an argument that tries to encourage the strike, i.e., they're not going to hit us back. I don't know that they, whoever they might be, is going to hit us back. But my concern is that a strike this time, given all the buildup and the angry rhetoric, that whether it's the Syrians or one of the other parties in the Middle East, that this could trigger something that goes far beyond Syria. This is one of my great concerns, that we're not just talking about relations between the United States and Syria and the Syria civil war, but how this could go much further. And I don't know how to evaluate the statements of the Iranians or Hezbollah. What have the Iranians said? The Iranians say, we'll decide this in Damascus. Well, that's pretty spooky. Hezbollah and Israel, the love fest that exists between them, they exchange, threats to one another, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very concerned about where this will go, and think of the statement that we've heard again and again and again. We might be able to start the war, but I don't know if we can stop it. So I'm very concerned about where this could go.
Having said all of that, isn't a U.S. strike on Syria much, much less likely now,
Yes.
if not
I think so.
inconceivable?
Well, it's less likely. Yes.
Yeah, very quickly to that point, I mean, we don't know. I mean, I think
Right.
Rob is right. We don't know what the consequences are, but I think there's some evidence that we can sort of look to that can shed some light on the question. Israel has hit Assad really hard 4 or 5 times within the last 2 years. Assad hasn't responded. He hasn't responded because he couldn't respond. The United States is much stronger than Israel. So I think that gives you some insight into what Assad perhaps could do. He's in a fragile position. He's in the middle of a 2-year war. I don't think he has a lot of options, and I don't think the Iranians. My reading of the Iranian position now is the new government in Iran wants to find a diplomatic way out of this, yes. And so they're not going to try and I think exacerbate the conflict if there's a military strike. But of course, this raises the questions. Should there be a military strike or not? And I'm of the view that a military strike simply to save Obama's face because he drew a red line and is not going to solve anything. It'll make some people in the United States feel good. And so a military strike that can save lives, I'm sympathetic and I would support if it was properly planned out. But simply a military strike to make Obama and some generals at the Pentagon feel good is not going to solve anything. In fact, in many ways, it would actually make the situation much worse because Assad will hunker down in his bunker. He'll come out and say, I defied the great superpower. He'll rally public opinion in the Arab Islamic world, and he will, tip the balance in his favor. So those are things to consider as well.
Andrea?
Yeah, let me just add. So it is the Israeli strikes we can take as a model or not. I mean, Israel has been bombing parts of Syria since 2001. Every couple of years they attack something. They buzzed the palace about a year after he became president, which was an act of humiliation. Right, and does nothing. So there's that. On the other hand, in Syria, the 73 war was celebrated under the Assads as a victory because they survived against Israel. So to your question about what are the implications, well, at least on the regime side, all he has to do is survive. And he doesn't have to, in that way, sort of living well is the best revenge or something. He doesn't actually need to do anything. I think we might also be asking about what are the implications of a non-strike.
It is now 1:46, 1:47. We'll take one last question. Professor Gilbert.
I'm sorry I can't wait. The discussion is fascinating, and there's a lot of good argument there. I wonder about the way we discussed the United States. I don't think that the intervention in Iraq was a disaster simply. I think it was a criminal activity. It was an aggression committed by a world power which was forceful on people. I think Obama was considering an illegal and immoral intervention even though he wanted to do something good, which is to stop the use of chemical weapons. But there's a big issue about whether we want the United States as the leading militarist power leading all of us what for money to put into the military, to wantonly engage in illegal and immoral activities while holding up lots of people who are often very bad. But sometimes, perhaps not so bad. I think Assad is awful. I agree with Nader. But the fact is, if the United States continues in this direction, it is not good for us and it's not good for the world. We have 1,280 military bases abroad. The French have 5. The Russians have 1 in Syria. It's the only one outside the old Soviet Union. The reason that I ask people questions about this in class routinely, can't talk about it, is that it's not discussed in the American press. So I want to put the spotlight on the United States. And I like Obama. Right? I campaigned for Obama. I don't like Romney. I don't like the Republican enthusiasts for war. But I think that the American people halting this is actually a great positive feature of what's happening. So I would hold up all those points and ask them to have comments.
Nader, I have a feeling that you might
very.
have some
I mean,
thoughts.
I'm in basic sympathy with sort of the position that you take, but I disagree. I guess fundamentally when it's applied to Syria. I mean, those people who are so understandably outraged at the possible military strike from the United States, or the possible military intervention by the United States or the West into Syria, and who do not also comment or incorporate into their analysis the ongoing, everyday intervention by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah on the side of a regime that's perpetrating crimes against humanity. I just can't take that argument seriously. Because the intervention that is taking place today as we speak, and has been taking place for the last 2.5 years, and that is primarily responsible for killing 100,000 people, is not the United States. It's Russia. It's Iran, it's Hezbollah, and other players. So, if all of the focus is on the hypothetical potential military strike by the U.S., of which there are legitimate concerns, and I think reining in and making sure that concentration of power does not sort of get out of hand, and that democratic societies can sort of rein that in and have it addressed and have it applied in the international system much more accountably, legally, morally. I'm all in favor of that. But when you apply it to Syria, there's a certain disconnect here that I think has to be addressed if one wants to talk seriously about the moral considerations that are at the heart of the Syrian conflict.
Any other responses to that point? Folks, here's the situation. We could probably go on for another hour. It is 10 till 2. We have to be out of this room at 2 o'clock. I think there's probably some pizza left, or am I wrong about that? There are many, many questions that remain on the agenda here. I think that this panel has done an excellent job of addressing some of the central ones. I hope that you're leaving today with some food for thought, lots to chew on. And this conversation will continue. I want to thank Andrea Stanton, Chen Reis, Rob Prince, and Nader Hashemi on behalf of the Center for Middle East Studies.